In February 1945, American troops broke through the gates of a prison camp in Manila and found 77 women who had, by every reasonable measure, been forgotten by the outside world for nearly 3 years. They were starving, some of them down to a fraction of their body weight before the war, their uniforms hanging off frames that had once filled them out. They were sick, several suffering from tropical diseases and malnutrition-related conditions that would affect their health for the rest of their lives. And every single one of them was still alive. They were Army and Navy nurses, and they had just survived the largest single capture of American military women as prisoners of war in the nation's history, after spending months on the front lines of one of the most brutal campaigns of the entire Pacific War, refusing again and again to leave their patients until they were physically ordered to. This is the story of the Angels of Bataan. Before the war reached them, the nurses stationed in the Philippines had one of the most desirable postings in the entire U.S. military. Sunshine, beaches, dances with young officers, a peacetime assignment that felt more like paradise than military service. On December 8, 1941, hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese bombers hit American bases across the Philippines, including Clark Field, and that peacetime posting ended in an afternoon. The nurses at Sternberg General Hospital in Manila spent the following weeks working around the clock as casualties poured in from the fighting spreading across Luzon. On New Year's Eve, as Manila's fall became inevitable, roughly 224 ambulatory patients were evacuated by steamer to Australia, and in the following days, Army nurses under Captain Maud Davison and Second Lieutenant Josephine Nesbitt began moving out toward the Bataan Peninsula in stages, setting up 2 hastily organized jungle hospitals, designated simply Hospital No. 1, first at Limay and later relocated to Little Baguio, and Hospital No. 2 at Limao, carved directly out of the wilderness with bamboo frames, palm frond roofing, and almost none of the equipment a functioning hospital actually needs. The 11 U.S. Navy nurses in the Philippines followed a separate and, in its own way, even harder path. Under the command of Lieutenant Laura Cobb, they had been running the Canacao Naval Hospital near Manila. When it was bombed and evacuated, they moved to makeshift facilities at civilian sites around the city, including St. Scholastica's College, continuing to treat patients even as Japanese forces closed in. Unlike the Army nurses, who escaped toward Bataan and Corregidor, the Navy nurses stayed behind in Manila and were captured directly when the city fell on January 2, 1942, interned at Santo Tomas months before their Army counterparts would eventually join them there. What followed made these women, in a very literal sense, combat veterans. They were the first large group of American military nurses sent into an active combat zone in the entire war, and over the following months they worked wards holding hundreds of patients each, under near-constant bombing and strafing, on rations that shrank week by week as the siege dragged on. Their crisp white uniforms didn't survive contact with the jungle. They were replaced first with oversized mechanics' coveralls, then with whatever homemade khaki clothing could be improvised. One surgeon working alongside them later wrote that sweat washed the powder from their faces by midday, leaving nothing but lipstick to match the blood on their hands. It wasn't glamour. It was just what the job had become. For nurses like Marcia Gates, a young Wisconsin woman who had joined the Army Nurse Corps less than a year earlier after working at 2 hospitals near her hometown of Cambridge, the war on Bataan meant tense nights waiting on a jungle dock for evacuation boats, while Japanese aircraft strafed the harbor, and long days treating wounds in conditions no training back home could have fully prepared her for. Gates was one of dozens of young American nurses whose entire wartime experience would be defined by this single brutal campaign. Women who had signed up expecting routine peacetime nursing assignments and found themselves within months running triage under artillery fire in a jungle clearing on the other side of the world. As American and Filipino forces on Bataan grew weaker from disease and starvation through early 1942, military leadership made a decision the nurses themselves largely resented. As the Japanese advance became unstoppable, the women would be pulled back from the front and moved to the fortified island of Corregidor before the peninsula fell, rather than risk them falling into Japanese hands alongside their patients. Some accounts suggest the order was influenced, at least in part, by reports reaching American commanders of the brutal treatment Chinese women had suffered at Japanese hands earlier in the war. A grim calculation about what capture might mean for the nurses that officers were unwilling to leave to chance. Many of the nurses were furious about the order regardless of the reasoning behind it. According to their own later accounts, some seriously considered disobeying it outright. They didn't see leaving wounded men behind as an act of self-preservation. They saw it as abandonment, and it stayed with several of them as a source of guilt for the rest of their lives. In the end, their commanding officer, Captain Maud Davison, gathered her nurses and moved them to Corregidor's Malinta tunnel just before Bataan's fall on April 9, 1942. The same day, roughly 60 to 80,000 exhausted prisoners were forced onto the 80-mile march to Camp O'Donnell that became known as the Bataan Death March. On Corregidor, the nurses simply kept doing the same job in a different, equally dangerous location, treating a constant stream of wounded inside the Malinta tunnel while Japanese artillery pounded the island above them around the clock. A small number of nurses managed to escape the Philippines entirely in the war's final weeks, in evacuations so limited that the choice of who left and who stayed weighed on the officers making it for the rest of their lives. On April 29, 1942, a handful of Army nurses were flown out aboard a Navy PBY Catalina seaplane, though this group's ordeal wasn't over even then, as they ended up stranded on the island of Mindanao and were eventually captured there anyway, just at a different camp than their colleagues on Corregidor. On May 3rd, the U.S. submarine Spearfish surfaced off Corregidor under cover of darkness and carried out a few more nurses, along with the only Navy nurse remaining on the island, Anne Bernatitis, and a small group of civilians, one of the last true escapes from the doomed garrison before its surrender. The rest stayed until there was no more war left to fight. When Corregidor surrendered on May 6, 1942, the remaining 66 Army nurses inside the Malinta tunnel became prisoners of war, joining 11 Navy nurses who had already been captured separately when Manila fell months earlier. Combined, 77 women, the angels of Bataan and Corregidor, were now in Japanese custody. What happened next was, in its own way, almost as remarkable as anything that had come before it. The Army nurses captured on Corregidor were initially held elsewhere before finally being transferred into Santo Tomas on July 2, 1942, joining the Navy nurses under Lieutenant Cobb, who had already been interned there for months since Manila's fall, reuniting for the first time since the war began nearly the entire group of American military women captured in the Philippines. The nurses were transported to the Santo Tomas Internment Camp, a converted university campus in Manila stretching roughly 10 blocks long and 8 blocks wide, that held roughly 3,800 prisoners by the time they arrived. Soldiers, civilians, and children, some of them entire families, living in cramped, deteriorating conditions for the remainder of the war. The camp was porous enough that internees with money or valuables could sometimes trade for small amounts of extra food or smuggle messages to the outside world, a small mercy that made the years there marginally more survivable than a conventional military prison camp might have been, though marginal is doing a great deal of work in that sentence, given what the nurses themselves witnessed and endured. And rather than simply becoming prisoners like everyone else, the Army and Navy nurses did something their captors hadn't necessarily planned for. They kept functioning as an organized medical unit. Under Captain Davison's insistence, she would later be remembered as the single most important reason so many of her nurses survived. The women maintained their identity as a working nursing corps throughout their captivity, running a functioning camp hospital, rationing what little medicine they had, and treating fellow internees through years of worsening malnutrition, even as their own health deteriorated right alongside their patients. Conditions inside Santo Tomas grew progressively worse as the war dragged on and Japan's supply situation collapsed. Rations shrank to near starvation levels by 1944 and into early 1945, and the nurses, many of whom had already been physically depleted by the siege of Bataan and Corregidor 2.5 years earlier, were now trying to care for an entire camp of malnourished, sick internees while suffering from the same deprivation themselves. Back in the United States, their story had already become a kind of public legend, well before anyone actually knew how it would end. Juanita Redmond, one of the few nurses who escaped the Philippines in the war's final days, published a memoir in 1943 that became the basis for a Hollywood film, So Proudly We Hail, turning the ordeal of the women still trapped in Japanese camps into a rallying point for the American home front, complete with recruitment booths staffed by Red Cross volunteers, set up in theater lobbies where the film played, while their actual fate remained genuinely unknown to most Americans. It was, in its own strange way, one of the more effective pieces of wartime propaganda of the era, built entirely around women whose real story, still unfolding on the other side of the world, nobody at home could yet confirm. Liberation finally came on February 3, 1945, when a flying column of the U.S. Army's 1st Cavalry Division broke through to Santo Tomas ahead of the main advance retaking Manila, arriving so suddenly that some internees reportedly assumed the tanks crashing through the camp gates were a Japanese drill until American soldiers appeared. The Navy nurses, held separately by this point at the Los Baños Internment Camp roughly 40 miles south of Manila, faced a more dangerous wait. As Japanese forces in the area grew more unpredictable and violent toward civilians elsewhere in the islands, American planners grew increasingly worried the Los Baños internees could be killed before help arrived. The rescue, when it came in February, was one of the most daring special operations of the entire Pacific War. Paratroopers dropped directly onto the camp at dawn, timed to a diversionary guerrilla attack and an amphibious force crossing a nearby lake, catching the Japanese garrison during its own morning exercises and freeing more than 2,000 internees, the Navy nurses among them, before retreating Japanese forces in the region could reach the camp at all. When the final count was taken, all 77 nurses who had endured the siege of Bataan, the siege of Corregidor, and nearly 3 years of internment were still alive. Not most of them, all of them, a survival rate that stunned even the doctors who examined them afterward, and won historians largely credit to the discipline and organization the nurses imposed on their own captivity, refusing to stop functioning as medical professionals even after they had officially become prisoners. They came home to a hero's welcome, parades, and a level of public fascination that many of them, by their own accounts, found deeply uncomfortable. Family members of men who had fought or been captured at Bataan and Corregidor wrote to the nurses by the hundreds, asking whether they had known their sons, husbands, or brothers, a reminder that, for many Americans, these women had become the closest living link to a defeat the country had never fully processed. Some of the nurses stayed in touch with each other for the rest of their lives, forming a bond that outlasted the war by decades. Others wanted nothing more than to put the experience behind them entirely and rarely spoke of it again, even to their own families. It wasn't until 1999, when a nursing historian named Elizabeth Norman published We Band of Angels, drawing on interviews, diaries, and letters from 20 of the surviving nurses, that the full detailed story of what they had endured reached a wide audience, by which point several of the women who had lived through it had already died, taking most of the finer details of their ordeal with them. Decades earlier, in 1980, survivors and the men whose lives they had saved dedicated a bronze plaque in their honor at the Mount Samat Shrine on the Bataan Peninsula, reading simply, "In honor of the valiant American military women who gave so much of themselves in the early days of World War II." Captain Maud Davison, the woman most credited with holding the group together through years of captivity, was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Medal in 2001, a recognition that, like so much of this story, arrived decades later than it should have. The Angels of Bataan and Corregidor never described themselves as heroes. By their own accounts, again and again, they insisted they had simply done their jobs. But their job, for nearly 3.5 years, was to keep treating the sick and wounded through combat, starvation, and captivity without ever once being relieved of that responsibility, not by the Army, and not by themselves. They had entered the war as women assigned to a peacetime posting in a Pacific paradise, and they left it as the largest group of American military women ever to survive captivity as prisoners of war, a distinction none of them had asked for and few of them ever wanted to be defined by. 77 women went into that ordeal. 77 came out of it alive. That is not an accident of luck. It is the direct result of a group of women who decided individually and then collectively that becoming prisoners of war did not mean they had stopped being nurses. If you want to hear the full story of the siege of Corregidor these women lived through before their capture, that's a story for another video. Let us know in the comments which forgotten battle we should cover next.